Good morning and welcome to Newspeaks Live. I'm Sylvia Mann with Caro, and we're here with Andy McGowan.
Müller-Maguhn.
It doesn't matter. With Lowell Bergman and Gavin MacFadyen, and we're talking about the mainstream media.
Yes, the title of this panel is Hacking Mainstream Media, which is about how when you blow the whistle and you have a story or you do the leaks, how do you get it in the mainstream media? What are the strategies? What do you want to get in? What do you not want to get in? And we're very happy to have three elaborate, experienced guests here who have possibly different perspectives on this issue. May I ask you, Mr. Bergman, you were saying in your session that you came from underground media, and now you're mainstream media. So what happened?
Oh, okay. Well, you say underground media. That's a misnomer, really. It was alternative media to established media at the time, and just as a little bit in the way of background, I just do this just to sound professorial. Is that people have forgotten that in the 1960s there was a major technological change in the communications industry. And the result was that newspapers, to sound familiar, were folding and going out of business. All the afternoon newspapers in the United States were going out of business. In order to preserve the newspapers, the daily newspapers, the Congress of the United States passed the Newspaper Preservation Act of 1970, which allowed newspapers to, so-called mainstream established newspapers, to operate as monopolies in their regional area. And antitrust laws were suspended. And then the other thing that happened was, part of that transformation was the movement from what was called hot type. I don't know, how many people here know what a linotype machine is? Okay. Actually, the Germans, big Mergenthaler, invented it. But anyway, and then, so offset presses came in, and that created a lot of capacity for printing, and printing cheaply. And at the same time, there was television, but in the United States, there were basically what they called 2.5 networks. ABC was the smallest of the three. It had been actually taken out of NBC by the government in an antitrust action, and created, because NBC was too big. But they were called almost a broadcasting corporation with small news division. So there were no jobs. Sound familiar again? No jobs in established journalism unless you could get into one of the newspaper guilds, which had locked up these monopolistic newspapers from the ground floor. So that's when I got involved in the media. Initially, I was a graduate student. We were in San Diego, California at the time, and it was a staging area for the war in Vietnam. Very conservative, and my thesis advisor was being harassed by vigilantes who were shooting at his house, cutting his phone lines. The governor of California, Ronald Reagan, was campaigning to have him fired as a subversive. He was very famous in Europe, but not in the United States. His name was Herbert Marcuse, and I was his research assistant. And I wound up, because of all the death threats, myself and a group of graduate students wound up being his bodyguards, because the local police were part of, as it turned out in the end, part of the vigilante organization. And we decided, I had some background in printing and growing up, and so that was my contribution, and we decided to put out our own newspaper, because the local media was always known nationally as amongst the worst in the country. And they were campaigning to have Marcuse fired, in their editorial pages. And so we started doing, in a weekly tabloid-sized newspaper, we started doing stories about the city and county of San Diego, and I'm going into some of the detail here because it's very similar. There was no internet, right? So, but what we did do was public records by hand. You know, you have to go in and look through all the county, for example, land records. And we started doing a series about who ran the city and county of San Diego, because you couldn't find out in the local media, and except if you went to the society pages, and then you saw there was Mr. San Diego of the Century, Mr. San Diego of the Year, and we focused on them initially, and to our surprise, they were all criminals. And I mean, it wasn't hard to show how they were violating all kinds of federal laws related to self-dealing and with publicly traded companies, and wielding influence not just in San Diego but in Mexico. Mr. San Diego of the Year at that time was also Mr. Tijuana. He was the gambling king of northern Mexico. He was American, Italian last name, and his brother was in the mafia. So that made a couple of good stories right there. So what I discovered was that, and we had a lot of trouble. The kind of press criticism was that I was arrested 18 times in 1 year by the police. There was that criticism of our doing a story about corruption in the police department. We were firebombed, shot at, and had a wonderful time.
But was the working of the media like your own newspaper?
Yeah, we had our own newspaper.
Yeah.
We had it distributed ourselves. The law enforcement and the FBI eventually got to all the printers in San Diego County. We were not allowed to print in the county, so we had to take our negatives. In those days, you had negatives we had our own negative camera, copy camera. And so we would take our negatives to Los Angeles. And the Los Angeles Free Press, which was another alternative newspaper, had bought its own offset press. So we could print there. And then we would ship the newspaper back down. So that's how I got started.
Now, I was wondering, in that same time, in Europe, Liberation was founded,
right.
the Tagenzeitung, the Morgen, LPs.
The Rolling Stone,
like
all of Ramparts magazine, but that's because of the technology. The cost of printing went way down with offset, and people in the U.S. people set up independent offset presses, and you could go in and they would give you credit. And they were putting out shoppers and free things and so on. So we didn't have to pay for like 90 days, and that was great because we didn't have any money. So
I'm trying to understand how come we sort of now have mainstream media, and we have the internet.
No, but the mainstream, it's very different now. The mainstream media is on the internet. Everyone's on the internet. It's free. It's such a huge change because distribution is free. You don't have to invest in a capital plant. Anybody can do it.
But are you saying there's no distinction between mainstream media and own media or own publications?
Sure, there's a difference, but the difference, now we're going to get into questions of practice as opposed to, and that's the bottom line is you go to places on the internet to get information that you trust. And most of the established news organizations have a system of digesting information and reporting it, which is relatively transparent. And so you know whether to trust it or not on a certain level, whether you may not trust it politically, but you know that there's somebody who with some experience has digested the raw information and presented it to you.
This information is at least verified by journalistic standards.
It has always been true.
Sorry, can you say it again? I couldn't hear you.
Just put it near your mouth, maybe.
No, I think, okay. No, I just said, did you say that the disinformation is then verified at least by some journalistic standards? So talking about what Pilger suggested when we look back at 2000.
Well, I don't agree with Pilger.
Like the Iraq. Okay, you don't have to agree with Pilger, but it is true that the start of the second Iraq War, was based on disinformation.
So start of almost every war is based on disinformation. Name one that was started without this information.
But that doesn't de-evaluate the argument. So
what
my
argument?
question to you is, because you just said that
being
the
cranky,
digesting...
That's
all right.
That's what I was told, to be cranky this morning.
That's all right. Me too.
Okay.
But, so you suggested that this digesting of information, that there's a relative transparent process of how information gets processed by the mainstream media.
I'm not saying it's objective. I'm just saying there's a process. The objectivity concept, okay, in American media began in the 1880s. Before the 1880s, there were no real standards in journalism as we know it.
And what's the definition of objectivity?
Well, in the 1880s, it was because another technological reason. The telegraph was invented, and they discovered that if you wanted the telegraph to be profitable, and there were newspapers along the route of the telegraph line, then they only put up one line to begin with. Then you wanted to sell your copy, right, to various newspapers along the way. They might have they might be segregationist if they were in the South. They might be pro-union in a northern, so on. So they came up with a style. It's called the Associated Press, was the organization. It's a nonprofit. It still exists today, and it came up with a style for filing stories so that all the newspapers along the way who were members of the Associated Press would run the copy. So they had to make it as bland as possible so they wouldn't alienate one member from another. So they came up with this so-called objective standard for reporting the news. So it was a commercial...
So no more taking a standpoint, but making it acceptable to everybody agreed in the game.
Making it as useful with the least amount of need for rewrite to all the customers. So
you
that's
mean copy and
beginning.
paste, rewriting as in copy and paste, what we call it.
They couldn't copy then.
They could, of course, but because the history of culture, if we go 2,000 years back, has always been about copying. It's always been like seeing cultural concepts and copying them. I mean, that's...
I see what you mean. But I mean, I'm talking about technologically, they couldn't copy it.
Can I ask you, Gavin, what is mainstream media?
I mean, I think Lowell has given an historical thing, which no, it's correct. I think that's how it evolved. I mean, what we're not discussing, though, here is the evolving corporate control of the media, where gradually the concentration of ownership, the power of vast assemblages of, in Europe, by the way, the same as in the States, the big German and French operations, the big British operations. The British operations, I think, are much smaller in comparison than to the American, but that's imposed yet a new modifying grayness over the whole matter, because there are interchangeable directorates as well. The executives of one company move quickly to become executives of another company. We know this in television, of course, so that they bring the same standards with them. And what that means is that the mediocrity of the conventional assumption is then spread in a kind of ghastly dead weight of sanctimony over their product, so that there are obviously highs and lows and all kinds of different factors at work. But that, for example, the New York Times is stylistically and editorially slightly different than the Washington Post. Certainly very different than the Chicago Tribune or some of the LA papers, and certainly very different than some of the ones in Europe. But what is the same throughout all of them is a degree of deference that is not uncommon in Europe, but quite common in the United States in particular. I mean, for example, that we could go on, and I think we'll...
What's your idea of the best newspaper? What is your best newspaper that exists? Your idea of the newspaper you like?
It's a good question. I'd have to struggle, I think, a long time to find one.
Do you read any?
Occasionally I do. I think we all find it occasionally useful. But I think, on the other hand, without citing Iskra, I think there are very few newspapers that...
you want to explain Iskra?
No, Iskra, I thought this is a joke, but one of the major papers of the Russian Revolution, which had arguments in it, and had arguments about the nature of political change and all the rest.
So Pravda wasn't one of your favorites.
No, it wasn't. I was never a great reader of Pravda.
Was that owned by a corporation?
It was owned worse. It was owned by an unpleasant government in its latter stages.
So I'm just trying to kind of like step back for a second. That's why
we haven't even stepped in yet.
Well, the thing that bothers me is that here's what I think I learned. You asked me the first question, going from the alternative newspapers to the establishment newspapers or networks or so on. Here's the thing that I learned that I tried to say yesterday that I think is very important. I learned that, and I was deeply involved in politically and philosophically. I was a graduate student in the history of philosophy, but it was actually the history of revolutionary thought, what we would call modern revolutionary thought, and I was and what I learned is that we don't have, there isn't one version of the truth, and you can do the best, and that what I learned from the established industry standards and practices in many individuals is that you need to test your story, you need to test your facts, you need to test.
What does test mean?
It means you report against it. Why do you believe that the story that you're doing is true or worth doing? Now, I could give you a whole example for any particular story, but take the opposite point of view and test your story. See if there are holes in your story, in your logic, in your information, in your understanding of what's going on. And that process allows you to I think, try to honestly present information without presuming certain things are true.
But are you now saying that mainstream media are better in that process than alternative media?
Generally speaking, yes.
Because the alternative media have too much of a position.
Not all alternative media, but yeah, basically you preach to the converted. That's what, you're an advocate of a certain point of view, that's what you include, and you don't include talking to the other side. And you don't include that, I'm not particularly in favor, for instance, of the drug laws in the United States and how they've been enforced. But I got lots of sources in the DEA and in various narcotics enforcement operations. I don't like the prison system in the United States, and I don't think it's the largest prison system in the world. But I want to know what's going on inside that system. I've got to know people who are involved in it and listen to what they have to say and take that into consideration. Yeah, I may not agree with them, but the fact they're there.
I think one of the troubles for us is, I think that a lot of us have come through the mainstream process with a deep suspicion of what authorities tell us. And I often find, for example, the amount of lying that I've been subjected to as a professional journalist over 35 years would fill encyclopedias. And yet we never are allowed to say that, particularly in Britain. The word lie is very rarely used here in the press. It's considered contemptuous. It's considered libelous in some way or other. So we say misstatements. We use all kinds of special language to cover up what are fundamental attempts to obscure the truth. For example, to give you an extraordinary fact, that I was at a public meeting about journalism, and I made this comment. It was the only remark that I made that they wouldn't quote, which was that there used to be 18 to 35 industrial correspondents in the mainstream press in Britain, which means the main quality papers and the tabloids, who were covering industrial matters. They were trade union correspondents, they were industrial correspondents, that was what they were called.
Right. There are no more labor reporters in the United States. There's like a handful.
There are none here. And yet they're 40% of the population. Well, so the 40% of the working population, with all of their problems and experiences and the crises and difficulties they live through, are not reported at all. Right? So that shows you something about the bias that actually goes on. It's not possible, for example, to report from a barracks, a military barracks. All of those things which we have done in the past, but the known mainstream paper would dream of doing that. And for example, I remember, I'm trying to point critically to what might be a very comfortable conversation. I'm trying to avoid the comfort.
I agree.
No, I wanted to take issue with what you were saying about bias, because I don't think that people with a particular bias don't not report the other side? I mean, isn't bias just perspective? And you should be honest about your perspective. And you can't not have a bias. I think that you should come to it saying, this is my perspective. And then, of course, you need to say something which is falsifiable, and you need to bring the evidence with you. But you can't come to it saying that, you know, I have no context that I'm coming from. So shouldn't you just state your bias and then back it up with evidence?
Well, you can advocate a point of view that you believe in and write about that, but that's an opinion piece.
No, that's every piece. Everyone is coming to it with an opinion. It's just about whether you are proving it or not.
I think that's a fair point, because we all know that actually the picture that is created by a piece in the media is containing a specific parts of the puzzle, and it's also created by leaving out specific parts of the puzzle. And so objectivity, or you know, the dream of being unbiased, or the dream of you had this other terminology of
I didn't say unbiased, so you
know.
No,
I know that.
So
but still the idea of this is the truth because we are objective. That's quite misleading.
No, but that's not what I was saying.
No, I mean, but at the end of the point, I mean, let me give you an example of actual times. I mean, we have this, what worries me more than the whole NSA shit is the reinvention of the Cold War in a speed. Excuse me, what worries me more than the NSA story is the reinvention and the recreation of the Cold War, so our relationship with like Russia and so on. And I mean, I'm living in Germany, that's our neighbors, okay,
right.
Just geographically, it's like 2
You
hours
got a
with a
hole
car.
in between.
So yeah, there's a little bit of hole in between, but they have a highway now, so you can overcome it. Polish people are nice, that's not what I'm trying to say here, but the point is that the German government obviously has a specific interest in the game. The American government has a specific interest in the game. And right now, for example, the German government has cancelled the German-Russian Cultural Council. Like they said, we shouldn't do it anymore.
So what is this council? Can you tell us?
It was just a cultural one every 1 year, like a conference where Russian, German people would get together on all kinds of level. And it's not a really, how you call it, a binding thing or whatever. It's just an exchange point of views and so on, and different developments in society and so on. So actively, the German government is intervening here and trying to avoid that this exchange of views is taking place. So, but that's not what gets reported. What gets reported is missing the perspective of the Russian, actually. That's what's happening in effect. So you cut the specific communication lines, and that's actually, I mean, I'm coming from a CCC, Case Computer Club, and Wouw Holland, the creator, he always believed in the importance of communication lines, especially if it comes to struggles, because when a war is being created, first thing happen is the governments cut the communication lines. People who talk to each other, they don't hit each other so fast. I mean, we might, you know, but I mean, you're on a personal level, but on a political level, that has been the historic truth. And so it is our duty, from my point of view, as a peacekeeping mechanism, to ensure that we have the different perspective. And it doesn't mean that we aim to objectivity, because that doesn't exist in some extent, but that does. So I'm really taking her point, because why not have like the really counter view of our Western thinking about specific things? But who's doing that? I mean, you said that the now mass media, or the now media, is kind of taking a better role here. I don't see that. Who's doing
No,
it?
I didn't say a better role. No, I said I learned something from people that I met and that I got experience with in the so-called established media. Yeah. There were a number of reporters here and there, the first investigative reporters in the modern era.
The so-called investigative reporters.
No, there were no investigative reporters, let's say, in San Diego, for instance. There was no one who called themselves an investigative reporter in 1970 in San Diego, California.
There weren't any reporters in San Diego.
Well, there were newspapers, there were television, radio stations. There were a couple out of Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Times, who used that name. There were 2 investigative reporting teams in the whole of the United States at that time, one at Newsday and one at Time Life. 60 Minutes, for example, was a television program. It was just in its fledgling stages. You're right, the mainstream media, I think I said it yesterday, I mean, a lot of the newspapers that failed in the United States in the 60s were terrible newspapers. And a lot of the newspapers that have failed in the last 10 years were terrible newspapers, and they weren't doing very much reporting.
And even some of those who survived are terrible newspapers.
That's true. So you've got one of Murdoch's papers hasn't survived, but that's because they were involved in criminal activity.
No, that's because they were involved in criminal activity and got caught with it. It's not means that the others are not involved in this. It's just that they are.
No, there were other. The Mail on Sunday.
It got caught and it got reported on.
I looked at your local media. The Mail on Sunday was doing exactly what Murdoch was doing. The Sunday Times was doing as a
using
Murdoch
intelligence records,
and the Observer as well. Yeah, they were all doing it.
Yeah. So people were doing that in the United States. I looked at the U.S. newspapers and the Murdoch operations in the U.S. trying to see, it seemed to make sense. Maybe they were doing the same thing in the U.S. I couldn't find it. And as far as I know, no one's found them doing similar things in the U.S.
Can I ask you something, Gavin? When you started to work with WikiLeaks and you worked with the Snowden revelations, how is it?
Well, it was...
Give us some good stories, please.
Aside from being exciting and relevant, suddenly we had documents that said something that so many of us already felt we knew and that we were entirely unsurprised by. But we had evidence. We had documents in front of us for the first time. And all the smears and lies that attempted to discredit the documentation, attempted to discredit the man who brought them to us, who said terrible things about whoever this anonymous, ghastly traitor in the American Army was, who had somehow produced this stuff. And we were working with it daily and hourly, a team of 27 reporters, and we were producing a Channel 4 film about that stuff, which was shown all over the world except in America, which attempted to show for the first time not who Julian Assange was and his eating habits, and whether they liked his socks or not, and his bad walking habits, but that the documents actually showed a couple of key things which only later got reported in the States, not at the time. And that's after the whole world had the story, and we're doing it. Things like, for example, the tens of thousands of innocent people being killed in what were called surgical strikes before. Now we know they weren't ever surgical strikes and all the rest of it. That huge numbers of people were being killed in Baghdad at roadblocks in a way that we had never seen before, etc.
Are you saying that the New York Times wasn't reporting this?
That's right.
Bullshit.
No. Let me give you the facts and figures. The facts and figures are that of 400 documents, for example, that The Guardian dealt with in that time, 4 were dealt with by the New York Times.
I know, but they
No, that's important.
Well,
why did they do so few?
Well, so you're complaining that the New York Times didn't give it enough coverage.
Well, Russian newspapers tell you about the Pussy Riot. That doesn't mean that the coverage is straight.
Was Assange on 60 Minutes?
No, but it's about him as a person. Not about the journalism.
Was he on 60 Minutes?
It's been on it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And was that piece fair?
On a personal level, sure.
And what is the biggest news outlet in the United States with the largest audience?
No, but we're talking about journalism here, not a personality thing.
I'm still using WikiLeaks documents. I cite WikiLeaks documents in all kinds of stories that I do. So does Reuters. So does Bloomberg. So does Los Angeles Times. So does everybody who can use those documents to help their story or buttress their story. A lot of those documents just say interesting things about totally non-ideological issues and they carry with them the imprimatur of the U.S. government. Right. I know a former State Department official, an old friend of mine, who now teaches in Washington. He's retired, and he told me that they use WikiLeaks documents in the classes that he teaches at Johns Hopkins, and all the Foreign Service people love it because they finally get published. Nobody else, they think they write well, and no one else reads their stuff. You know, they file all these cables, so you've got a huge fan in the infrastructure of the U.S. government that you're publishing their work. People are finally seeing it.
Do you think that WikiLeaks gets credited for this fairly?
Sure, they get credit.
Fairly.
There are references to WikiLeaks.
We say WikiLeaks. A script I just wrote, where and in these WikiLeaks documents, and then in the film, we track down the State Department guy who wrote them, and he goes on camera and he says, "I can't tell you that I wrote them because they're still secret."
I mean, this is a very interesting discussion, but it has nothing to do with what we are meant to discuss here, from my point of view.
That's like normally. What is hacking?
Yeah, I don't know who wrote that title. But my idea was to discuss here how we maximize impact on the stuff that we think should be getting in the mass media, meaning getting the attention of the human race, so to say. I mean, when the computers came up as a media, when mailboxes came up and so on, I mean, the hippies that I grew up with, so to say, they had this wonderful, they saw this wonderful opportunity of, we will decentralize media. You can get like decentral input reports of all kinds of stuff. There's no more burden of money or media organization involved. And they also saw the fear. They saw that, oh God, maybe they will forbid computers. That was in the 70s. It sounds totally unreasonable today. But they feared that, oh God, this has such a power as a productivity tool being distributed all over the people. Maybe the government will forbid it or something. I mean, they did other things, but no, okay, this is just historic piece. However, what we're ending up today is we still have quite an importance of specific big media organizations because there is storytelling. I mean, the process you just described as an ideal process, you would have this different point of views and so on, and where I could somehow agree to it, requires also people who take that intellectual challenge to not read the simplified version of the Prada of the truth of, Saddam did that, and that's why we do that, and now we rebrand Al-Qaeda to ISIS and, keep on the terror challenge, and that's why we need to do this and that, but to really analyze the different parts of the story and make your own standpoint. So, I mean, that's actually not really happening. That is maybe happening on an individual basis, and I see many people who do, of course, in the media, not only watch the CNN site and the Reuters and whatever, but also go to the smaller media outlets, the alternatives or whatever. However, the question is, does it change the narrative? So coming back to John Cusack's question. Was it Cusack?
No, it was
excuse me.
Sy
Hirsch. Yeah, the counter-narrative thing.
And counter-narrative is important, and
yeah, but do we have it?
No, but you don't have it in the generally speaking, because
it doesn't scale yet.
Generally, the media is not very good. I mean, period. It's
okay, but we're not here to blame. We're here to involve ideas how to change it.
But that's interesting because
changing?
I felt like Liberation, the Tagenzeitung, Appis were very important newspapers for me when I was growing up because they were a counter-narrative.
Yeah.
And I don't know
what happened.
Where is that now?
I thought it was on the web.
Yeah, some of it is on the web, but it has a different.
Is going bankrupt.
Sorry?
Liberation is going bankrupt.
Right.
It's going bankrupt, really?
Yeah.
Standing with you in the fight.
Good, very good.
Yes,
I
right,
like it.
Because it's owned by the readers.
The model.
No, but it's a very quick answer. You say it's on the web, yeah? I don't know what the audience thinks.
No,
it's a different feeling.
The truth is out there, just doesn't have any impact. So what does it tell
Well, that's, look, I mean, I gave up the idea.
You gave up?
I gave
Why
up
are
the
you sitting
idea.
here?
No, I gave up. Well, because he asked me to come. That's all. I gave up the idea that because you do a story, something's going to change. I gave up the expectation.
Did you see Wag the Dog, the movie?
No.
Oh gosh, please, that's really important.
Oh, I know what you mean.
I mean, there's so many different currents here. It's very hard to know, to isolate which one we're going to argue about.
Right.
We're trying to argue here.
That's what I was trying to
What do you think about objectivity in the media?
Objectivity?
Yeah, do you think that it's just a tool to spread lies under this veil?
No, I know the extent. It's to spread whatever the predilections of the journalist and his employer are. Journalists are, in the large measure, soldiers. They obey their officers. The officers pay the bills. Journalists have mortgages. All those things work. And so the greatest damage that's often done in reporting is done by self-censorship, not by editorial stuff. It's by people who are frightened of a lot of things. And there's a lot of good reason for journalists to be frightened of a lot of things. We've seen it all. I've seen it for 40 years. Some of the best reporters I've ever seen have done some of the most despicable things. And it often happens. It's not unusual because the financial pressures, the political pressures are enormous. The social pressures in some cases, particularly in Britain, are very, very,
Well,
very heavy.
you know, if you're working in a news organization, and I don't think this is new, I knew when I went to work, let's say, I worked for a Hearst newspaper for a while. That was a bad idea. But they were the ones in San Francisco, so I tried it, but it was terrible. You know when you go to work for a news organization what they want. They have a style, they have a slight, usually a point of view, a purpose, and they also want to sell newspapers and they want to get advertisers. If that model is going to work. The advertising side of it doesn't work anymore, so that's
But it's
a real
also,
big...
politically, it's more pernicious than that. I think the effect is when you get a huge story which bubbles into life, like Snowden, then suddenly you see where the problems are, where the crises are in the mainstream press, where people are terrified of it. I remember seeing the New York Times reporter in London, saying on camera to somebody the most appalling misstatements about what was actually going on with Snowden, that Snowden was, at that particular moment in time, I think his name was Burns.
John Burns.
Yeah, they were implying that there's a reason why he stopped in Russia. Nod, nod, wink, wink. That we knew what that was about, and if it wasn't him, it's going to be the Chinese. And all these people are damaging American national security and all the rest of it. And this was presented as totally objective comment by what was an incredibly biased and unpleasant right-wing position. And yet the New York Times never apologized for any of that. And the Post was slightly better, I thought, mainly because Dana Priest had done some very good work
Bart
before.
Gilman was involved.
And he was involved but didn't do a lot, but he did some.
He was one of the people
he
that
was one of
Snowden
those who did.
contacted.
But I mean, what I'm really suggesting was that when we came across the reality of all that, and particularly those of us who were involved in the WikiLeaks disclosures, we had some unusual sensitivities there. We were used to gross distortions, in particularly the British press, about it. The hatred of Assange, for example, in the British press takes your breath away. There was a period for 2 years in which almost every day The Guardian launched savage attacks, personal attacks, never about the journalism.
Wait a
Never
second.
about the documents.
What do you think about that?
Well, but I'm saying that was the problem.
Well, I don't want to get in the middle. I think a lot of what went on with Julian, but as background, Julian came to Berkeley to our symposium before he was famous, partially on his way. He was in Iceland at the time, and we have a panel every year which is about new things that are happening in the media, in investigative reporting. And we heard about his gun camera footage, and that he was in Iceland, and so we invited him to come, and he came, and he wound up getting stranded in Berkeley for a week, and that's how you met him, right?
Yeah, I did, of course.
And Julian's an odd guy. I just say that up front. I mean, I'm a little odd. So
I think a lot of us
one
are
of the
odd.
reasons I live.
I think that's
one
a
of the reasons I
compliment.
live in Berkeley. And he's, and I think what Keller did, and I said so publicly, and then Keller came back we had Julian back the next year.
Right.
By then he was under house arrest, so we had him back by Skype, and then we had Keller and Der Spiegel, and we had everybody on a panel.
Let me ask you a straight question into this. Don't you think, I could imagine that from a government point of view, when you have revelations about activity that might change the narrative, and you have one person who seems to be the pressuring point in that process.
You go after that person and you try to discredit them.
Exactly. So now we're talking about spin doctoring, and maybe that's the...
No, we're talking about psychological and political warfare.
Yeah, that is spin doctoring.
Exactly.
That's just another terminology.
The idea... I know people who think that Snowden's a traitor.
I think these people are traitors, but...
But they say that to me. These are government people or former government people who think he's a traitor.
Let them think that, but how...
No, because they say, who is he to decide what's going to be secret and not secret? Okay, who is he to do this? And I point out to people, I believe that the Chinese, the Russians already were already downloading. When Chelsea Manning was downloading, they had already downloaded everything because there was it was so easy to get access to one of these laptops. And I think similarly, these million people who have top secret security clearances, note that Daniel Ellsberg and Snowden were both private contractors. They were not government employees when they decided to get all this information. So the privatization of intelligence information and access to it has led to all this leaking. You don't hear, there was a little bit talking about that with Snowden and with Manning. Now two people have to look at everything, or Snowden's thing, they're trying to figure out what to do because the Beltway bandits. So it gets to be a very complicated, it's not such a easy thing, but the bottom line is the Snowden documents got published.
Only a small part.
But if it had happened in Russia, they wouldn't have gotten published. The Snowden documents got out.
But that doesn't argue the case that in America, a tiny fraction got out. We're talking about of 700,000 documents. You're talking maybe 40 or 50.
Well, whatever the chosen people who have access to this, right, have chosen to release, has gotten out.
No,
a lot of us.
No, it's actually not true.
No.
Here it's
Not
gotten
true.
up.
Can you explain it?
It's really far more complicated, and it looks like maybe you missed my talk on Friday because I talked about the conditions of the process of these publications and the limitations of that process due to legal constraints, other people involved, due to many different layers, which I don't want to repeat here.
No, I heard what you said.
Okay.
Yeah, because this is very sensitive information, according to governments. Powerful governments around the world don't want to see this published, right?
Yeah, and other governments and but I mean, in the interest of the human race, maybe it is in the better interest to publish all of it. I mean, the questions, are these governments in our interest acting, or are they maybe in this specific area more protecting their self-interest? Because, I mean, everybody has self-interest. That's not an accusation. That's just how it is.
Right.
And governments have specifically, if it comes to secrecy, have the opportunity to hide away from accountability.
But I think there's another argument as well, and Lowell was pointing to an argument which suggests that there may be a legitimacy, in a sense, in a government's concern about the release of its own highly critical material inside the government. And I think one would take that, I would take that more believably and be more sympathetic with that view if, in fact, I felt the government had told honestly what it was doing, that there was a high degree of openness and transparency, and therefore accountability for what they do. But we're talking about governments that have lied about the most important and critical factors in modern history, which have resulted in hundreds of thousands of dead people. I'm reminded of a particular case. Well, we're talking about, for example, Vietnam, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was a fraud, and that resulted in a war which killed 3.5 million people. We're talking, you want to go to Iraq and Afghanistan, we can tell the same stories. Everybody knows what I'm saying is true, right? But does a government official say anything about it? Nothing. They say absolutely nothing about it, and then they complain that if Julian or Bradley Manning publishes something, or something comes out from them, they've got blood on their hands. And that nobody says, that what a ridiculous and absurd thing for generals who kill millions of people, that they're complaining that we have blood on our hands.
I know, but Gavin, I want to know why you're so surprised. Why are you...
Because I think that's the reality, and we often forget the reality. We're often so concerned about our professional obligations, whatever they are, that we forget that the truth is that we're talking about mass murder on a huge scale.
where's the objectivity here? Where's the objectivity of the media when you have governments acting that way and pretending then that others like take the blame when they disclose what the governments have been doing? Where's the objectivity of the media here?
I'm not saying that the media is objective about it, because the media that you're talking about, I'm trying to figure out what you're talking about. You're talking about the profit-making, apparently you're talking about the profit-making commercial media organizations, primarily in the United States. Is that what you're talking about?
I'm not here to blame specific things. I'm here to try to find out how we can change the perception of things, how we can change the narrative, while we, of course, have to study the limitations of the existing media mechanisms, established institutions, and so on.
I think the real question
to get to the mechanics.
Right. The real question that you want to get to is, how do we make our stories, and in this case, let's say the Snowden story, more accessible, or get it to more people?
Yes.
Right.
Or if it's the example area of Gavin, what he just pointed out, it could also be about stuff in Iraq. It could be about Syria. It could be about Russia. Snowden is maybe one.
I think the problem is that the Assange Manning download had in it documents that a general audience, you could make relevant to a general audience in many, many ways. And whether it was the combat logs in Afghanistan or just the individual countries you could go to and look stuff up. The problem with the Snowden information so far, from what I've seen, is that we're talking about this whole metadata, we're sucking up, vacuum cleaning everything out of the sky, and so on, and this is mass surveillance in the words people use. That's attractive in the United States to libertarians, to Ron Paul. Right-wing libertarians don't like it. It's attractive to the sort of left liberal or left community, and to the general population. What does it mean? They don't, it doesn't affect it directly their lives. It's very difficult to make it concrete. But I'm just saying, to the average person, it's not as concrete. It's harder to write something meaningful to someone. And the other side of it is the information being handled responsibly? In general, what I've read in The Guardian or elsewhere, in most places, it seemed that way to me, but then there was a Der Spiegel piece that I read that Laura Poitras's name was on it. And it was very, very specific about the NSA's internal operations inside the United States, and some break-in squad and so on. But it included detail on a level that I didn't understand why that was in the piece, because it didn't help the reader one way or the other. It was just, we know what the address is of their secret location. And so you put the address in there. For what
it's to overcome the abstraction that
you could have said it's on a downtown street in a so-and-so location. You didn't have to put the name, the number of the address.
How do you want to overcome?
It's exactly the NSA asked us to do.
Okay, good. I was.
We were confronting, in certain cases, we were confronting the NSA with the stuff we wanted to publish, and they exactly want to get out every detail, which
they wanted to get out.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
So would you think we would have to follow the NSA in that case as journalists?
No, we don't have to follow the NSA. I'm just saying that we need to.
Hopefully not.
No such agency. This is NSA. It always reminds me of this. I did a story 25 years ago about a building in Arlington, Virginia, that had no name on it that they were building, and nobody would tell us what the name.
Yeah, but don't you think it's important for ordinary people to understand how it exactly? So why are you blaming the Spiegel for going to publishing that details that are exactly the way of presenting information where people have a concrete idea?
Well, I don't understand
it's
why
not
the
an
NSA
abstract
would want the addresses out. Did they explain
why?
They
wanted everything out.
They wanted all of it published?
No, out in the sense of they wanted redacted out the addresses. They wanted redacted.
Oh no,
out.
he just said that they wanted it in. That's what I heard.
No.
Oh, they wanted all of it out. All of it
Yeah,
all
out
yes.
is in redacted,
Oh,
out is in out there.
Okay, that wasn't clear. Okay.
Well, but you published it anyway. If they wanted
Yes,
it
of course
out.
we did, but we did it with a purpose.
Well, what's the purpose?
The purpose was to make people concrete, not abstract they are doing these things, but to give them a concrete picture of where it happens, how it happens, so that they can really understand it. So it's about human beings trying to get a picture about something that has been hiding from them for a long time. And so the question is, and we're back to the question of which we wanted to discuss here, how to get the impact, how to make people understand the relevance for their life. And make them understand.
Could I come on this?
Yes.
I'm Pete Goyoth, and until 2 months ago, I was working for CNN, so I am the evil mainstream media. I'm about to start working as an investigative journalist at the CPI, so I'm trying to work in both of these worlds. And I think one of the things that I'm hearing from you, or particularly from Lowell and Gavin, is this struggle between the campaigner and the journalist. And when a campaigner who's done investigative work comes to a mainstream media organisation, their passion and their energy and their perspective on that story is sometimes so overpowering that it makes it impossible to see that story and to publish it. So when we're presenting investigative work into the mainstream media, just to bring you back to the focus of this, which was supposedly hacking mainstream media, i.e. getting the voice into mainstream media, then those campaigners have to come in with a mentality of balance within that story, accuracy, being able to prove what's in that story. And that to me, which is where I'm going to come to the question bit, is what was so upsetting in a sense last night for me for hearing Julian being quite so aggressive on The Guardian, because the WikiLeaks, the distribution of those WikiLeaks stories originally through those 4 or 5 newspapers, or 3 newspapers in the original consortium, was an incredibly good way to use the instincts of the journalists, their ability to sort through information, and their ability not to bore people to death. You know, there's a hell of a lot of boring stuff in tens of thousands of documents, and they found the gems.
Well,
so they need.
But
there may be gems still to be found. But what I'm saying is, Julian used the skills of all of the journalists on those papers incredibly effectively to hack the mainstream media. What have you got to say about that and how it ended?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of issues in what you raise, and they're good ones. I think one of the difficulties, for example, with The Guardian was that, as their editor has subsequently admitted, that every article, for example, in the Snowden case, has been submitted to the State Department first to be cleared. Every article. And in fact, in that same piece where Rusbridger said
this
that...
happen at the Spiegel too?
No, well, it's one thing at a time. I think that what Rusbridger said was that there's no way, he said, I'm going to even touch Iraq and Afghanistan. In other words, because of the sensitivity of the Americans to anything having to do with that. You then invite the secret police into your building, allow them to point to you and say, they are the secret police. You're not allowed to photograph them. You're not allowed to know who they are. They operate anonymously in plain clothes, right? That's what we call a secret police in most countries. And that's what they do here. They come into the building, and the editor of the newspaper says to them, we open the building to you, and we will destroy what you say we should destroy. Now, it may be that there's a kind of shenanigans here, because we knew that a lot of this material was already in Brazil and New York and other countries. But the truth is, it set a precedent. It meant that it was legitimate for a newspaper editor to invite the secret police into the building to destroy the evidence of one of their most trusted sources. That's what it meant.
Were you talking about Snowden?
You were talking about Snowden, yeah.
Yeah, but he was just talking about WikiLeaks. And I know.
But it's the same principle. We're talking about the same principle.
No. There was a question, and I think it was, I thought the issue that is you want to get in the mainstream press. You want to get your exposure out there. The example is a consortium. I remember when the consortium was being created. The consortium was created. It operated. It was unprecedented. You got the New York Times. In 1997, I convinced CBS News and the New York Times to do a story together in print and in video at the same time on the same day, right? Never happened before. Okay, So the idea that a mainstream news organization, at least in the way the U.S. operates, would collaborate with other newspapers and share the same information and work out a way to work together was unprecedented, had a huge impact internationally. It all fell apart for various sort of small-minded reasons, which is the fault, the sin of the human being. And, you know, I agree, but at the same time, the then executive editor of the New York Times, who then wrote these things about Assange, found himself under attack for doing that, not because, for no other reason than, what are you doing? I mean, here's the messenger. Why are you, you know, who cares whether he's an oddball or not? Is the information accurate? That's what we care about. And so a lot of people went up to him and told him that, a lot of his own reporters, right? So there's your example of how to get into the mainstream media. It's been done. Now, there may be a difference in the Snowden collaboration. The difference in the Snowden collaboration, I'm just giving you a little feedback. The New York Times was frosted that Snowden didn't go to them.
Well,
He did. He did.
He tried to, but
Yeah.
they didn't
And they turned him down and said, "Who is he?"
Well,
That's true. He
they
was
didn't
ignored.
know, but so did Glenn Greenwald. I mean,
Yes,
you know,
but that's-
initially he didn't know who he was.
No,
He
no,
might
it wasn't
have
that. Greenwald was approached by Snowden because they thought he was a good reporter. That was the reason.
But this is also a huge issue for the mainstream media, which I used to be in, which is that we were totally unprepared to receive this material.
Right.
That's right.
And I do think, Gavin, we need to address at some point more this question that Lowell raises, because it was an unprecedented piece of cooperation. The main reason that the Snowden coverage is only in the Guardian in the UK is because every other newspaper can't stand the Guardian because of Hackinggate, because of press regulation, and because they despise it. It's a competitive issue and a loathing issue, not because it isn't an excellent story. So,
No,
but I do think we on the mainstream media have to be looking at that Canadian thing yesterday, looking at having the tools to receive, process and analyze this material. I can tell you my own previous organization was not in a position to receive or manage or cope with that level of data and handle it well. It would have been in the same position.
No, but I think, you see, I think we're making a mistake. And the mistake is to confuse the technical capacity of journalist organizations to deal with encryption and all the rest of it, Tor, with their political sensibility to actually print and use this material. Because after all, if you knew there's a source of extraordinary material out there, and you don't have the technical capacity to do it, and people did know in that period, you can hire somebody in to do that, right? But if only if you're really
They didn't know. They missed an opportunity. They were kicking them. You know, they were kicking themselves that they missed this opportunity. But there are other. You know, I think the problem with the Snowden information so far, for what you want to do, is how you make it beyond just a revelation, but how does this really affect people's lives? Now, I was approached by the Directorate of National Intelligence in the United States, the new post 9/11 intelligence sort of Uber agency. Huh? Yeah, and the question that I was asked was, how do we improve our ability to get our story out? Okay, they're feeling like they're just getting pounded. Okay, and I replied and said, well, you got to have a counter narrative. Is that familiar? And
thank you. I mean, that's what they're doing right now. They're just trying to say Snowden stuff is over. Like as they did just a few days ago in Britain, they say, well,
yeah, I just got an email from them yesterday. I said, you guys have any questions that I should raise at this conference? And,
yeah, I mean,
and the answer was, that's over.
Exactly.
Of course,
What did they mean?
I mean,
well, they're trying this for
old
some
news.
months now, but they made just a synchronized approach in UK and US to say that the NSA is important for counterterrorism, and that the NSA should be doing what it ought to do, and end of discussion.
Can be done again.
So what? How can we kind of make
well,
them
maybe there's
collaborate?
some real difficulties there, because the sources that would come with stories like this particularly in bulk storage, which are unique. We've never had this kind of release of information on that scale before. But even the Pentagon Papers is microscopic in comparison with the disclosures we've had in the last while. The key problem is, how is the source protected? And what we've learned from these collaborations is that the source is often not protected. The source is held vulnerably. That there, in fact, in some cases, and particularly in the Assange case, where Julian Assange was subjected to endless smears and personal attacks for 2 years by a newspaper that obviously was very upset by the fact that their behavior on a lot of issues was questioned, and their selection of material was questioned, and a lot of other reasons that are very complex, and I'm not sure I even know all of them, or even could understand some of them. But what I did understand was that, like a lot of journalists, my outrage at the treatment of Julian Assange was because it would not only destroy the credibility of somebody with the courage to come forward to do that stuff, which is very difficult, and he's paying a huge personal price for it, just like Snowden is now too as well. They haven't attacked Snowden in quite the same way yet, although I suspect that'll start.
He's American, though.
But that's right. But it's a slightly different area, and a different political process is in place. What I would simply say, though, is that the source of this material is the key question. Because what you want to do, if you're a journalist, is to encourage more of this kind of truth-telling to occur.
And Manning got 34 years.
That's right.
Right? But for being in the shadow. In other words, Manning is a non-entity because Julian was the public face of the documents. Manning was not. And
the most vicious attack I ever saw on a source was on PBS Frontline, an attack on Bradley Manning. A personal, vicious attack on a poor kid who they denied was being abused in prison, even though a senior State Department official testified that he was, and resigned in protest.
The UN Rapporteur on Human Rights?
No, this wasn't a UN issue at that point. It was an internal American issue. But the problem for the PBS, as an example of people in deference to the state, was that they took the state's line completely and attacked this kid who was being abused in the most appalling fashion in this military prison, and never said anything about it, and allowed his drunken father to attack him on television and all that. It was really an appalling thing. And that really was beyond, and that was a public broadcaster, the liberal voice in the United States. And that was worse than anything that ever happened here.
That'll just show you how liberal it is.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's true.
It's true. What I meant, Gavin, is that Manning, unlike Snowden, the interesting thing with Snowden is that, and with the footage that the documentary Citizen 4, is that Snowden had thought through what he was doing and had some sense of how to deal with the media and how he wanted to be treated. Mm-hmm. And he pulled it off. It was by the skin of his teeth, and that's what makes the movie dramatic, the film. But at the same time, obviously, he didn't have fully thought through where was he going to wind up. Right. Yeah, so of all places, he winds up with not exactly the world's leading civil libertarian as a guest.
Well, thank you so much for your time. We come from Montenegro. Yeah, well, we come from a country of Montenegro in southeastern Europe, and we represent a foundation that was established in the memory of a murdered journalist. He was killed 10 years ago in front of his office. His name was Duško Jovanović. And hearing you, we have several questions, and they would like to hear an answer from you, because more locally, like the topics you are just discussing, he was also involved in reporting about serious issues. Not for the global audience, of course, more locally, but the principle is pretty much the same. So how do you basically protect sources if it's more locally, where the attention of the global media is not so high, and you have real difficulties in protecting yourself from the state authorities? That's the question number one. And since his murder has not been resolved yet, what can journalism community in a European or global level
was a
do?
journalist, not a source.
Now he was a journalist. But what can basically journalist community in the European level, or if you want on a global level, can do to make pressure on the national governments to investigate crimes against journalists?
There's Snowden sitting with a government that assassinates journalists, right?
He's not sitting with the government.
He's in the custody of a government that is not exactly friendly to journalists, and there are a number of people who believe that the government has been involved in assassinating journalists in Russia. So that's a really hard question.
Yeah, but that's not his choice. They pulled his passport and stuck him there. So I mean, he had no choice but to remain there. I don't think he was very happy about remaining there either. So I mean, so I don't blame him for that. I don't blame therefore anybody who suggests that he's there on purpose or that he's doing some spying work. I mean, that was all nonsense. Total nonsense.
Bribing journalists and making them, putting them as soldiers, to use your terminology, in a framework where their freedom to report about the real important issues in a real important way it's more comfortable for you than the direct action that some governments take to suppress journalists, even like getting the job or getting the story, right? So I mean,
I understand the question.
Well, the question is, I mean, you presented the way, like the Russian way of. I mean, I see governments as.
No, they're asking a question. What do we do in a situation where the government is allowing or condones the killing of journalists? You go to Mexico, you know, they kill more journalists in Mexico than anywhere else in the world.
Yes,
it goes on all the time, and what do you say to people?
Well, I mean we have freedom of press issues, and we have constitutional issues and basic human rights issues in many countries, but that's not exactly the thing that we wanted to discuss here. No, I mean that's all right, but I mean it is a legitimate question, and I mean, if it comes to source protection, and be it to ensure that the next source will come up. I mean, Sarah Harrison was actually the person who redefined source protection, from my point of view. Because source protection is not only you don't mention the source and you don't make obvious phone calls that can be intercepted, but you take the bloody source and bring him out of danger.
No, I understand. That's an important. I am currently getting obsessed with this issue because in recent reporting stuff that I've been involved in, it isn't necessarily a life or death question in these stories. It's more like people say to me, well, if I go public or I tell this story, I'm going to be sued in every state in the United States and every court. Who's going to defend me?
Yeah,
right?
So what we need is, in theory, a fund. Like, we need a lot of money to make it, for the next source, not risky, but like something that can be compensated. So.
Isn't there a problem with involving money? Because then people can be accused of doing it for the money. I mean, I know that it costs money to do it, but that would be a problem.
The problem is the news organization. The problem is if you want to maintain some kind of standard, where particularly one of the legal problems is if you, as a reporter, if I give a source something of value, like legal representation, for instance, that immediately raises all kinds of questions. If there is subsequent litigation in terms of liability, or is the person telling the truth?
I'm not sure.
No, that's true. No, that's true. But I don't think that's the issue for building an autonomous organization. For example, like one of the things that the CIJ has done in Britain is to build an independent whistleblowers organization. And I think it's the same thing could be done internationally. Courage has been set up to do that. For Snowden and people like Snowden, we need independent sources, not the broadcasters or the publishers.
I'm more worrying about Manning in this case, because Manning, with the 34 years in front of him, I mean, what I'd like to do is at least make him a millionaire. That he at least has all. Yeah, I mean, it got to be. It can't be the narrative.
I don't think you can spend $1 million.
They're trying to make an example here, right? They're trying to hang him to the highest trees. to make everybody scared of, I shouldn't do that because my life will be shitty.
Of course.
So we have to change that narrative, and we have to make it, I mean, we will maybe with some legal representative be able to reduce 34 years to 20, but still that's, you know, far too much. So the money argument I'm trying to make is that he at least gets the ability and the support that will make it as comfortable as possible under the circumstances. I mean, and this is not necessarily about the Guardian or the established media, you know, setting up a budget for the next whistleblower, but it's their duty and their responsibility to kind of acknowledge the role the source has played. And the risk.
But it's like with Sarah Harrison, as you mentioned. I mean, she's stuck in Berlin. She can't come back to Britain. Yeah. Jake Applebaum doesn't feel it's safe to come here. Laura Poitras said she couldn't come here. Yeah. A Yale professor didn't come to join us in this conference because he was frightened of what might happen to him at the airport here. Yeah. That's I should have mentioned it before, and if you want any factual detail, I'll happily provide it. Yeah. But it was a disgrace, and yet we can't. None of the papers so far have published any of that.
Tell us about this Yale professor then.
I'll happily provide all the information later about it. He was supposed to come and join a legal panel. He's a professor of law and at Yale, and he's got a long reputation involved in free software and open software issues. And he was supposed to come and comment on this because he's widely known as an expert in this area. And he suddenly got a message a couple days ago saying, I'm sorry, I can't come. I've been advised that I could be stopped at the airport, and I don't want that to occur.
Well, I've been playing with the idea and talking to some attorneys about this, of trying to create the model. The name I use for it is the Court of Last Resort, which was actually a feature in True magazine. You're not old enough to remember. I have to proofread it back when I was a typographer. But anyway, and basically what it was at that time it was Earl Stanley Gardner who wrote the Perry Mason books, and he had F. Lee Bailey, who was a criminal lawyer, and he had the warden of a prison, and you could write in with your, some injustice had been done. And they actually did the Sam Shepard case, if you know that, which became the Fugitive story. But that there would be an independent board of people, and you as a journalist or whomever could go to the board and say, there's an individual, Gavin MacFadyen. He is inside a corporation. In fact, I don't even want to give him your name unless you pledge that you'll keep it secret. Mm-hmm. But here's our material. Look at it. He needs to be defended because if he says what we believe is true publicly, they're going to ruin his life. Mm-hmm. They're going to make his life unbearable. They'll sue him. They'll gag him. They'll do all these various things in the legal process. He won't be able to defend himself. And I can't, as a journalist, do anything for him and help him, Mr. MacFadyen, survive, because I will then be criticized for having given him money or something of value, and therefore his information isn't necessarily true. I need you to certify that his information is of a public interest, and that you have the resources to handle whatever hassles he may have if he tells the truth, right? And that we would have such that's what I've been thinking about, because I've run into this problem now repeatedly where there are these multi-billionaires who have a reputation. First of all, they go after the press, particularly smaller publications, and sue. They have this thing where they only sue the reporter. They don't really sue.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. And they tie you up, and they run you into bankruptcy, and they do all this stuff as retribution. And the story's true. And I didn't tell the story yesterday about my 38-year-old story that turned out to be true? Okay, so in 1975, I and a colleague and I got sued. We were freelancers, and we got sued for $630 million, when that was real money, by four guys who were out of Las Vegas. And basically the story was that they had built, it was out of my San Diego reporting, They had gotten the financing from the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund. This was before it was identified by the U.S. government and adjudicated in court 10 years later that it was an arm of the mafia and controlled by them. So they got hundreds of millions of dollars in loans from this pension fund, and they built this big golf course and real estate development in northern San Diego County. So it was basically the legitimization of organized crime in America, and the place was a gathering place for all these hoodlums and as well as Hollywood stars and all kinds of other people. They sued for $630 million, and the litigation went on for 10 years. They said to the court, $20 million. It was eventually disappeared in an exchange of letters. It went away, but no one else ever wrote about them again. 38 years later, and one of the guys, the lead plaintiff, became the second largest shareholder in Time Warner, a Hollywood mogul, married Barbara Walters for 2 years, who told me, I guess he's not in the mob, is he? She said to me. And so he went bust in 2000 because apparently he leveraged all his stock in the dot-com bubble. Okay, so he's destitute. 2 years ago, Vanity Fair magazine decides to do a feature, look for him, and whatever happened to this Hollywood mogul, right? They walk in and the reporter calls me and he says, Lowell, you won't believe this. I said, what is it? Well, I went in to see Merv Adelson to track him down, right? Mm-hmm. And in his little apartment in LA, and all he wanted to talk about was how he had a handshake deal with the mob in 1955, and that's why his whole fortune, everything he stood about was true. Mm-hmm. 38 years later, what do you do with that?
Hopefully report it.
Well, it's been reported, but now he actually, as he said in what was published, they actually won because people were afraid to write about them afterwards just because of the cost of litigation. Hmm. So in my career, I've lived long enough to have something like that happen.
Well, and Chuck Lewis was attacked by an oligarch.
Well, it was the center.
The center was, yeah, the center was attacked, and they almost sunk the center. I mean, it was an appalling travesty. But I think the issue for us is not so much organized crime figures, which are a legitimate target of anybody's inquiry, but the role of the press in terms of national security issues, I think, in a certain sense, because it's those issues which are the most sensitive. It's those issues which subject us to the greatest difficulty. We talked earlier, but when we were trying to plan somehow or other how we would organize this conversation, that there were two areas which were impossibly difficult for journalists to deal with in the mainstream press. One of them is corporations. Major corporations are immensely rich people, like Lowell's talking about, are very difficult to deal with because they have enormous resources, larger in some respects than the media does, and they can come after you, and they can cause enormous damage, and they cause enormous chilling effect for other reporters who want to deal with. For example, when is the last time we saw, in any important way, a major corporation dissected in the American media?
Well, the New York Times and Walmart. What happened? Nothing. He won a Pulitzer Prize, David Barstow again, a friend of mine, and the Obama administration may fine them for bribing in Mexico openly for 10 years.
But after 25 years.
But
it's true, but it's after 25 years of everybody knowing what was going on. And part of the problem was that Hillary Clinton was on the board of Walmart, which made it even harder.
Question here.
Hello, yes. I'd like to come back to the question of the mainstream media and how they fail to collaborate due to competition. And I'd like to bring the hackers back into the question of hacking mainstream media. How do you see the potential of open source models, which are very regular in the online environment and hacker environment, and the potential of online media for everyone to publish their stories to challenge mainstream media in bringing out controversial stories. So instead of keeping the debate in how the mainstream can just be hacked from within, how do you feel that the online environment can challenge them more?
Huh?
Well, I mean, I think there is good chances to do so. However, we need to slightly raise the standards of online publishing, also if it comes to blogging and so on. Yeah. So what we need to do is to get to the quality of always having the accuracy through documenting the source, so referring to the source.
Standards, you want
to say. Standards. Yeah, I'm talking about standards. So to make whatever we publish online as robust as possible, and also to provide the sources, I mean, the source material, not the sources I'm talking here. And I think there is good chances to do so. And I mean, there have been cases where mainstream media have picked up blogger stories and so on, just because they were providing maybe something very directly from a decentralized location, like something which had the evidence, which had the pictures of maybe police violence. Now, I mean, now with the open racism debate in the US, I think there's a great chance of decentralized media to provide a more accurate picture than the mainstream media, because they failed to do so for a long time. So, but that's just trying to give an answer to that. So.
Does anyone else want to pitch in on this one? And then we'll open it up if anyone's got more questions.
No, it's good.
Do you want to open? Has anyone got any questions? Yep.
It seems there's a big disconnect between the older generation here and the younger generation. And the problem, as I see it, being 76 and having been around a lot of young people who were experimenting in the late 80s and early 90s with what we called new media then, there is an opportunity to create long-form documentaries which have the resources of the histories of all the stories that people like Gavin and Lowell have worked on for 40 years, which young people don't have because they haven't been on those stories for 40 years. And there are young people who have digital skills, working with programmers and artists, and a kind of visual literacy that the older generation don't know how to do. And there is also this incredible opportunity to have with new media, I still call it new media, but anyway, the media we have now, to have layers of understanding. I think they're called iDocs, and nobody knows what an iDoc is yet, I think. But I think that's the future of investigative journalism, and I'd really like to know from people in the audience and on the panel what you think of this.
Shall we just collect some questions? Thank you.
My name is Martin. I'm from the German newspaper Taz, die Tageszeitung. And I have one question, maybe more to the organizers. I found this Congress pretty enlightening, and for us it's interesting, especially to see your conflict with Guardian and what happened, like, you know, between WikiLeaks and Guardian, because that is the main question in relation to this question here, hacking mainstream media. So how do activists deal with mainstream media, and what can we learn from all of it fucking off? Like, so I would have found quite interesting to go to see the conflict in real, like Alan Rusbridge to be here. And I just would love to know why he isn't. So didn't you invite him, or didn't he want to come? And why is it that, you know, for us in Germany, we saw that Guardian had quite a lot of balls in relation to what we would have thought German media would do with all the public pressure here in London. And I can see all the critics, but I would really have loved to get this conflict like in life, you know. So what's the response on that? Why
isn't the Guardian here?
Okay, no, I'll tell you why. It's a good question, because normally I think there's a lot to be said for confronting adversaries and a genuine debate about issues like this. There were a couple of big issues. The second most powerful person in the Guardian was approached by me to involve the Guardian directly in what we were doing. And that meant Rusbridger, and that meant another person as well. They declined. They were also to come here and participate in streaming everything we're doing. They pulled out. I think that probably had a lot to do with Mr. Pilger in what he said, but nonetheless, they did pull out.
When did they pull out?
They pulled out one day before the conference began.
On Thursday.
On Thursday, yeah. But they offered to do. We were very excited because we thought there'd be a lot of people watching everything we're doing. And but I think also the difficulty was that they perceive the independent press, the Guardian, as some kind of challenge to themselves. And there's a degree of curious hostility there that I always found very difficult to deal with. I mean, we have a lot of friends in the Guardian, a lot of good Guardian reporters, a lot of personal friends of mine. They're a long history. I've written for the Guardian in the past. I mean, a lot of things. It's not that. It's that this particular issue is very sensitive, and the issue of, for example, Assange is particularly sensitive because I think there's a lot of regret inside the Guardian, among a lot of reporters, about how shabbily they treated him as a major source. And I think that's something they probably don't want to dig up again.
Well, you guys dug it up yesterday. I mean, you know, and so my question, you did invite them and they declined.
Yeah.
And did you invite individual reporters to come?
Well, that was an open invitation to anybody to come.
To come be on a panel, talk about...
No, we didn't invite any individual person from any paper. It was an opening call, as everybody knows here, who's here as a reporter, that we were opening it up to everybody was welcome to come. There was no prohibition whatsoever. We didn't invite specific reporters.
What I'm hearing is, why wasn't Nick Davies came?
He was here,
and he was one of the first people to deal with Assange at the Guardian.
He was perfectly welcome. Yeah.
But he didn't have an opportunity to sit on a panel or reply.
No, he didn't in that case because he came in very late. This was the first time that Nick Davies had appeared at any meeting of this kind in a long, long time. He's not a meeting goer.
Are you trying to ask why?
No, I'm trying to ask his question. That there's, and I personally had the same, when I looked at the lineup of the conference, I said to myself, where's the other side of the story?
Well, you can read it in the papers. I mean,
wait a second.
It's nothing new here.
Hey, this is a journalism gathering. Where's the other side of the story? Don't tell me, hey, you can read it in newspapers. I mean, you know, where...
Well, I mean,
you had this very successful collaboration that made worldwide news, that impressed people in many countries that participated. It fell apart. There's a lot of acrimony about it. Assange didn't mince words yesterday. You haven't minced words.
No.
Nor
have they.
No, but this is the question is, why weren't they present to reply?
Yeah, but you have to ask it to them. So.
Well, no, they weren't invited, as it turns out.
No, they were invited. Hold on, let's be very clear. A formal invitation was given to me to David Lee. David Lee said he would approach the people to do that, right? What happened? Where are they? They're not here, right? So it's not as though we didn't make the effort. The effort was, I made a very pointed effort. The reason I can do that is because David Lee happened to be on my board. So it was very easy for me to phone him up and say...
He's still on your board?
No, he's just retired. He's retired from journalism, so... He's not here anyway.
Okay, there's another question here.
Yeah. So just following up on the idea of the other side.
He formally retired, but he's back working.
Oh, probably.
Low. Yeah. So in the beginning, you guys talked about objectivity and testing stories, and in particular, Gavin, you said that there was reluctance to just call a lie, right? Is that a fair phrasing? How do we deal with spin, I guess, that when either the administration or the targeted stories try to spin to shut down particular stories, and that's a failure of the MSM in a way for the mainstream media. In that, false equivalence in a lot of stories that we see around climate change in particular. How should we deal with objectivity in that particular context? And Lo, I guess from your background of tobacco, that same problem has been dealt with for, 40, 50 years?
I don't understand. I mean, you guys, I think all of you have to start thinking about, how should I put it, the realities of what you're calling mainstream media. The realities of it. Tobacco, I can tell you that I was on a suicide mission to do tobacco thing. The story of the tobacco story, my tobacco story, wasn't that tobacco was bad for you. Everybody knew it was bad for you. The story, the tobacco story I was after was we had a live witness inside a Fortune 500 company, only the second time in the history of the United States that a fiduciary officer of a Fortune 500 company would stand up in public and talk about what went on inside the, you know, I've gotten mafia people to go on camera and CIA people, but never a corporate vice president of a Fortune 500 company. That was the issue, and that the company, but why it was a suicide mission was that the guy that I got was going to be the witness in a grand jury that was investigating the alleged criminal behavior of the son of the guy who owned CBS. So it probably wasn't going to happen. I just was surprised about the way they went about killing it, which was kind of stupid. But because there's a lot more sophisticated ways of killing stories. But
so, sorry, having the family relations there is odd and an exception for most of us.
But what I'm getting at is that all news organizations have limits on what they do. Self-censor. They have limits on what they're going to do. You've got to analyze the organizations and see where are the openings in this particular. No, the word hacking. What you guys talking? What does hacking mean?
Well, hacking means to.
I thought hacking meant you got people's voicemail messages.
No. Hacking is about finding ways to access or to get into a process in order to do something about it. But actually, I mean, as we are running slightly out of time already,
right.
I think my summary, and also coming to this question about how to handle with the spins and so on. I think what's really necessary and what maybe has to be a separate workshop at some point is to study what's called crisis PR. Crisis PR is the art of how corporations, governments, or entities of whatever type manage if they are threatened by publications or by reporting or by something that happened in their shop and that gets public and that they somehow need to counterspin or deal with. And I mean, crisis PR has many chapters. It's a complex art. It has to do a lot with narratives. It has to do with attacking sources. It has to do with like claiming that things are not true, or like I could quote the last chapter. You know, if everything fails, you can still say, "Oh yes, I am a pig," because then you cannot be accused of anything anymore. That's also a way of killing the story. But in between that last chapter and the introduction, there's quite some mechanics that are worth studying and that I think are important to understand how, if you are a reporter or if you have the interest to get something big in the media and you're attacking an entity that has resources, legal resources, spin doctoring resources, maybe former journalists or corrupt colleagues of yours who would for money help them to cope with your revelations, how to deal with it. And in a mechanical, tactical way.
There are people who are experts on how to do that, and who work in those areas, but they're usually highly paid, and not necessarily.
Absolutely.
You know.
We've got time for one more question, so we're going to. If you want to follow that.
Thanks. In light of what you were saying earlier, the general discussion about the apparent atomization of bias, do you think that campaigning journalism is a good thing?
The campaign?
Campaigning journalism?
Yeah.
Campaign journalism, that you're journalistic and campaigning.
Well, if you're some organizations get stories and they turn them into their story, and they'll keep running it, like you were talking about the thalidomide example, and it works. If you stick on a story and you're dedicated to it.
But also it alerts the public. And the extraordinary fact of that is that one way of making the public not forget stuff is to keep repeating it in new forms so that people understand that it's still ongoing, it's still real. But in answer to your question.
Can I just clarify? I'm not talking about the campaign when you're campaigning to get a certain story out there so that people know about it. You know, campaigning to... Sorry. I'm not talking about campaigning to continue to tell the truth on a particular situation. I mean, when people are campaigning to bring about a change in the law or a very profound change in social perceptions permanently?
The form that takes, I think, is obvious. About 70%, according to Chuck Lewis, of investigative reporting now in the world is not in the media. It's in NGOs, it's in nonprofits, it's in foundations. I mean, in this country, Global Witness, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, I mean, all of these organizations now employ a lot of journalists, and particularly journalists who found it often difficult or compromising to work for right-wing newspapers. So you find a lot of very interesting people now working for NGOs, and some of these people are really excellent. So the standard of reporting has improved immeasurably in that sector. And in fact, when students come to us and ask us, where should we go to work? There's no jobs at The Guardian or wherever. They go to work for NGOs, and rightly, and they get very good experience. It's either that or going to work for Kroll. And the other alternative is to go to work for private detectives. That's the real world we're talking about here, about where people really go to work. And the trouble when you go to work for organizations filled with spooks and often very difficult people with a long and complicated relationship to really bad people is you have to take a decision about what you're going to do with your life.
Thank you so much. That was very interesting.
You're alone in this.
Thank you so much. This has been Newspeaks Live. I've been here with Gavin MacFadyen, Lowell Bergman, and Andy Müller-Maguhn. I'm Sylvia Mann. I'm here with Caro Nevian. Thank you so much for watching.
Okay.